I don't hear you well. I don't know. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, so that's I guess that's the important issue. Okay. All right, should I start?
Yeah. Yes, your volume might be low, but yeah, we could hear you. You could start.
Okay, I don't know. Yeah. Okay. This week, Sedra Behar Bechukosai, and of course, you have the Tochacha and Bechukosai. And the Tochacha and Bechukosai talks about the calamities and the tragedies that will overtake the Jewish people as a result of not adhering to the commandments of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to the mitzvos of the Torah. And toward the end of the Tochacha, the Torah says, which to a certain degree are words of consolation, V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov, v'es brisi Yitzchak, and I shall remember my covenant with Jacob and also my covenant with Isaac, v'af es brisi Avraham eskor, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, v'ha'aretz eskor, and I will remember the land of Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi, some very interesting Rashis on that pasuk. But one of the questions Rashi raises, it really comes from the Torah's Kahanim, is it says, "V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov." It mentions, remember, I will remember the covenant of Yaakov, of Jacob. V'af es brisi Yitzchak, and my covenant with Isaac. V'af es brisi Avraham eskor, and my covenant with Abraham I shall remember. The words remember are mentioned in conjunction with the bris, with the covenant of Jacob, and it's also mentioned in conjunction with the covenant of Abraham. But in regard to the covenant of Isaac, the word Zachar, remember, or Eskor, I shall remember, is not mentioned. And the question is, why is it that the word Zachar is remembered in regard to the covenant of Abraham? It's remembered in regard to the covenant of Jacob, but it is not mentioned regarding to the covenant of Isaac. It's implied by its association with the other two, but it's not stated explicitly as the other two is mentioned. In the same way the other two are mentioned. And Rashi says, a very interesting thought. It actually comes from, as I mentioned, the Torah's Kahanim. He says, why isn't the word schira mentioned in conjunction with Yitzchak? Ofrel shel Yitzchak, the ashes of Isaac, appear before me on the altar, piled high on the altar. And the question is, first of all, what does that mean? And secondly, how does that answer the question? Now, when we take a look, and I have discussed this in the past, at the Torah and Chumash Bereshis, the largest part of it is to talk about the lives of the Avos and the Imos, the matriarchs and the patriarchs. We find that there's a lot mentioned about Avraham, and there is a lot mentioned about Yaakov. but very little is mentioned about Isaac. And at one time, I suggested, and then I saw that this was mentioned also in the name of my uncle, that the name Yaakov, that Yitzchak is the symbol of Dusha, of holiness. And the more holy something is, the more hidden it is. The Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, the Kohen Gadol, could only go in once a year on Yom Kippurim. We see Sifrei Torahs, when they're not used, are covered up. So the more holy something is, the more it is hidden. Matter of fact, my father would always mention, and this seems to be a very obvious thought, that the whole concept of tznius, of modesty, is not because the human body doesn't have significance. On the contrary, because it does have significance. And that's why there is a concept of tznius, of covering it up, because that which is important, that which is valuable, one hides, one covers up, one does not show off. And however, I think that there is another possible answer. And I've mentioned in regard to the Akedah, the famous question that the Ramban asks. The Ramban asks, why is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God had to test Avraham? V'Elokim nisa es Avraham. He tested Avraham by giving him the commandment to take his son Isaac and put him on the altar. And the question is, God certainly knew that Avraham was going to pass the test. Why was it necessary? And also, we need to understand, why is it that the Torah emphasizes very much the role of Avraham, of Abraham, in the Akedah, in the binding of Yitzchak on the altar? And the Torah does not emphasize much the role of Yitzchak, who allowed himself to be bound on the altar. In Tfilas and Slichas, we do give credit to Yitzchak also, but in the Torah, very little credit is given to Yitzchak. The focus is on Avraham. We need to understand that. And the Ramban, in discussing why God had to test Avraham, the Ramban says, Lahotzi mehakoach el hapoah, to take it from the state of the potential into the state of the actual. And the question is, what is the Ramban trying to tell us? And I mentioned my father gave a very interesting explanation, and it could be this is the simple explanation of the Ramban, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu certainly knew that Yitzchak would succeed in the test that he was given, that Avraham would succeed in the test that he was given. Asar Nisyonos, Avraham Avinu was given 10 tests, we say in Pirkei Avos. And he emerged successfully from all 10 tests. There's an argument whether the Akedah was the 9th test or the 10th test. But whatever it was, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows everything. But the problem was that Avraham did not know his own potential. And sometimes we are limited because we do not know our own potential. So it was important for Avraham to know his own potential. And I want to suggest another explanation, whether the Ramban means it or doesn't mean it. It certainly could be the Pshat in the Torah. The Avos, they teach what is the function of the Avos. And for that matter, the Imos, they teach by example. We don't have much in terms of mitzvos being given through the Avos. Our sages tell us that the Avos, the patriarchs, observed the whole Torah. But in terms of what the Torah tells us, in terms of obligation, very little is mentioned, certainly explicitly, through the medium of the Avos, of the patriarchs. Most of it was Moshe Kibul Torah Misinai. And even the things that were given through the Avos was also, the Rambam says, because it was renewed at Sinai. But for the most part, we learned through the different experiences that the Avos encountered, as mentioned by the Torah, through their example. The Avos taught us not so much, but by what they commanded us orally, but they taught us by the example of the way they acted in all kinds of different situations. And while this is true in all areas of life, be it areas of mitzvos and be it areas of halacha, teaching by example is very important. But certainly when it comes to personality traits, to a large degree, they can only be taught by example. And the Avos are our primary example when it comes to learning traits. And we could suggest that when the Torah in Chumash Bereshis tells us about the lives of the Avos and the events they encountered and how they reacted to these events, the Torah is doing so in order to keep the Avos alive, in order that we should be able to live by their example. And we find, even in the Haggadah, we say to a large degree, V'achshav kirvanu hamakom la'avodaso mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avoseinu. Originally, our ancestors were idol worshippers. V'achshav, and now, kirvanu hamakom la'avodaso. It puts us together, equates us with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. In other words, the Torah saw as its purpose in Chumash Bereshis in a sense, keep the Yavos in our era, in our time. So we should continue to learn from their example. Now, there were certain traits that were very successfully transmitted. And consequently, the Torah did not have to emphasize those traits. However, the traits of the Avos that were not so successfully transmitted, the traits of the patriarchs that somehow were not so successfully transmitted, the Torah had to emphasize to keep those traits alive, to keep the example of the patriarchs constantly in front of us. And that's what Chumash Bereshis is. Chumash Bereshis is not a biography of the Avos. Chumash Bereshis is keeping the Avos, the example of the Avos, alive. So we should learn from their traits. And in certain situations when they might have made mistakes, if it's pointed out by the Torah as such, so we learn from their mistakes also. Together with them, we learn from their mistakes. So now take a look. Very little is mentioned in the Torah about the Emos. Why is very little mentioned about the Emos? Because the Emos were the traits that they had were given over through nurturing. And because of that, it was successfully transmitted. We might not identify it with them, but they were the main nurturers of the Jewish people, and their traits, their character traits, were successfully transmitted. The Torah did not have to emphasize their role. It's not a question of giving credit, it's a question of teaching. However, the traits of the Avos were not so successfully transmitted. And the traits of Yitzchak, however, the traits of Yitzchak, more than any other one of the Avos, were successfully transmitted. Not so much the traits of Dusha, but the traits of Mesiras Nefesh, of giving one's life over for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was transmitted by Yitzchak. When we bang on God's door with our tefillos, whether it's Rosh Hashanah or on Tanesim or Yom HaKippurim or in any time of trouble. So we mention about Yitzchak. Why? Because the Yitzchak is the source of Mesiras Nefesh. And throughout the generations, we have always encountered B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chaluseinu. In every generation, and certainly in the generations of Golus, of exile, the one trait that the Jewish people had was Mesiras Nefesh. And people who might, in their daily lives, did not necessarily act in the preferred way, when it came to Mesiras Nefesh, there was real Mesiras Nefesh. Whether it was the Mesiras Nefesh of being killed, or the Mesiras Nefesh of going out and fighting on behalf of the Jewish people. Jews who were not observant even in our day. But you see the Mesiras Nefesh that they have when they go out to fight on behalf of the Jewish people. Sometimes not enough credit is given to them for what they do on our behalf. But where did they get this strength? Where did they get this ability? They got it from Yitzchak Avinu. And Chazal tell us that they knew where the Mizbeach, the altar in the Beis HaMikdash, should be built. When they saw the Afro Shel Yitzchak, obviously B'mara HaNevuah, when they saw the ashes of Yitzchak piled. But what ashes of Yitzchak? Yitzchak at the end, putting aside Midrashim, he was not sacrificed. Avraham was about to sacrifice Yitzchak until the Malach, the angel, came out from heaven and said, Al tishlach yodka lanar. So where are the ashes of Yitzchak? Yes, there are ashes from the ram that was given in place of Yitzchak. But I think the ashes that they saw on the Mizbeach, on the altar, was not just the ashes of the ram, but it was the ashes of the Jewish people throughout the generations who gave their lives with Mesiras Nefesh on behalf of God and on behalf of the Jewish people. Ushmeinu karasa b'shmecha. The Jewish people are identified with God. And when Jews give their lives on behalf of the Jewish people, they are giving their lives on behalf of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. So the ashes that are piled high are the ashes of the Jewish people who were Moshe Nefesh. Where did they get this ability? They got that ability from Yitzchak. The Torah didn't have to emphasize Yitzchak's role. People throughout the generations were Moshe Nefesh. But to a large degree, Mesiras Nefesh of another sort was not so successfully transmitted. The Mesiras Nefesh, to a certain degree, of tying the children to an altar, not necessarily chas v'shalom in the sense of dying, but in the sense of living al Kiddush Hashem. And for some reason, whereas Jews were ready to be moser their own nefesh, the idea of transmitting their children from Mesiras Nefesh, that they were hesitant to do. The Torah had to emphasize the role of Avraham and not the role of Yitzchak, because Yitzchak's traits were successfully transmitted. And so, in other words, there is a difference between Zachar, remember, and Nireh, is seen. Seen, Zachar, is something of the past. I remember something that happened. When we talk about our ancestors, when we have a special tefillah on Yom Tovim, and especially on Yom Kippur, we call it Yizkar. We remember the past. Nireh Lefanai is seen before me. That talks about the present. One does not see the past. One remembers the past. The present is not remembered. The present is seen. So, Afro Shel Yitzchak, the Afar of Yitzchak, is Nireh Lefanai, is seen before me in the present, because the traits of Yitzchak were successfully transmitted. And we could suggest that as we approach the holiday of Shavuos, I'll give a special Shavuos share about it, about Shavuos, but just in conjunction with this, I want to say, take a look at the holiday of Shavuos. When you look at the holiday of Shavuos, Shavuos is identified with Matan Torah, with the giving of Torah. We say in our tefillahs, Man Matan Torah Seinu, the time or the period or the season of the giving of the Torah. But it's interesting. When it comes to Pesach, the Torah tells us explicitly and at length about the historical event that is the foundation of the holiday of Pesach. The first part of Chumash Shemos, and time again, why do we eat matzah? Why do we eat maror? Why do we give a carbon Pesach? When it comes to Sukkot, the Torah says, L'man yedu doroseichem. Why do we sit in the sukkah? The Torah tells us why we sit in the sukkah. But when it comes to Shavuos, the Torah does not explicitly identify it with the giving of the Torah. And the question is, why is it that the Torah does not deviates from the practice it had in regard to the other two regalim, where they explicitly state the historical event associated with the holiday, and by Shavuos they don't. But the answer is very simple. The answer is that the answer is that the Torah only mentions the historical event when there are symbols associated with the holiday. So the Torah tells us what is the symbol by Sukkot. There's a symbol in the holiday of Sukkot. We build a sukkah by Pesach, matzah, maror. So the Torah has to explain, what does the symbol come to remind us? But when it comes to Shavuos, there are no symbols. So the Torah doesn't have to remind us. But then the question arises, why is it that there are no symbols on Shavuos? And the truth of the matter is that Shavuos is not the only holiday that does not have symbols associated with it. Shmini Atzeres, which is identified with the 8th day of Sukkot, does not have symbols either. It's true in Chutz La'aretz, according to the Psak Shulchan Aruch, not that it isn't a matter of controversy. We sit in the sukkah, but we sit in the sukkah not because it's Shmini Atzeres, but because we're scared, we act as if we're concerned that it might be still Sukkot. So in a certain sense, there's a common denominator between Shavuos and Shmini Atzeres. And the Ramban is very explicit about it. The Ramban says that to a certain degree, Sukkot is the Shmini Atzeres Shavuos is the Shmini Atzeres of Pesach. And we have to understand, what does that mean? In the Medrash, it's mentioned that just like there are 50 days between Pesach and Shavuos, there should have been 50 days between Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. But why isn't there 50-day separation between Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres? because right after Sukkot, the rainy season begins. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want for the Jewish people to have to track back to Yerushalayim in the mud that came as a result of the rainy season. Consequently, the Shmini Atzeres became attached to Sukkot, being the very next day. But ideally, Shmini Atzeres should have been 50 days after the beginning of Sukkot. And the question is, what was the significance of this idea of 50 days? What does 50 represent? Now we know when someone is an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, so technically he's a slave for 7 years. The 7th year he goes out. He's a slave for 7 years, but if he says Ahafti es Adoni es Ishti ve'es Banai lo eitze lachavshi, I don't want to go out. I want to stay a slave. I like my master. So then he stays as a slave to his master until the Jubilee year, which is every 50 years. An expression of the Torah is Va'avodo L'olam, and he shall be his slave forever. Now we know it's not forever. At most, it's for 50 years. What does the Jubilee year, the 50th year, represent? It's obvious that 50 years represents the idea of leaving the former era and entering a new era. I think that this is the difference between Pesach and Shavuos. Pesach is about the past. And in a sense, we're required to go back to the past, to re-experience the past. Chayav Adam liros es atzmo. He has to see himself as if he just left Egypt. But Shavuos, even though it's the day of Matan Torah, it's about the present. It's the era of Torah. The era of Torah began on Shavuos with the giving of the Torah. That was the beginning of the present from a certain perspective. We need symbols to remind us about the past. We don't need symbols to remind us about the present. And I think this also is the idea behind Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. Sukkot represents the Jewish people traversing the desert. God giving them sustenance, giving them cover, Danani HaKavod, giving them housing. Through their trip through the desert, on their trip to Eretz Yisrael. But the question arises, what does Shmini Atzeres represent? I want to suggest that Shmini Atzeres represents the Jewish people, the era of Eretz Yisrael. Even though the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael was Pesach time, but it was the era of Eretz Yisrael. It began with the Jewish people entering Eretz Yisrael, and Shmini Atzeres commemorates the Jewish people being in Eretz Yisrael. And in a sense, that also represents the present, not the past. This is the era of Eretz Yisrael. It's true that we are in Golus. We are in exile. And that's a deviation from the way things should have been. But this is the era. This is the era of Eretz Yisrael. And that began when Yoshua entered Eretz Yisrael. And Shmini Atzeres, when the Jew goes from his temporary dwelling, I think I mentioned this, when he goes from his temporary dwelling to his permanent dwelling, that's identified with Eretz Yisrael, because even though we might be in Golus for thousands of years, Golus is only temporary. It's only temporary because even in Golus, we go from place to place. We're never able to establish roots. It's a figment of the imagination of those who thought they established roots, and those that were foolish enough to believe that before the Holocaust. If they still believe it, they're even more foolish and more stupid. And Eretz Yisrael, that's the permanent dwelling of the Jewish people. And if we do go to exile because of our virus, that's a deviation from the way things should be. Today, we are in the era of Eretz Yisrael. When the era of Eretz Yisrael, when we deal with the present, we don't need symbols. So both Shavuos and Shmini Atzeres doesn't need symbols. The 50 days between Pesach and Shavuos, and there should have been 50 days between Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, is symbolic of going from one era, the era of the past, into the era of the present. Now it's very interesting that the Zohar says, I hear people are going around quoting statements from the Zohar regarding the tragedy that took place, in Eretz Yisrael on Lag BaOmer. There is no such Zohar. The Zohar is talking about a past event. It's not talking about Jews who were killed. It was talking about oppressors of the Jewish people that were killed. But the Zohar tells us that Avraham is the symbol of Pesach. Yitzchak is the symbol of Shavuos. And Yaakov is the symbol of Sukkot. Now, why is Yitzchak the symbol of Shavuos? I would say Yitzchak is the symbol of Shavuos because Yitzchak is the symbol of the symbol of being tied to the altar. Nasa v'nishma of Matan Torah. The acceptance of the yoke of heaven that we did at Mount Sinai. That is identified with being tied to the altar. But it's more than just that. Shavuos is the holiday of the present. Since Shavuos is the holiday of the present, Yitzchak, in a sense, is the symbol of the patriarchs of the present. Why is he the patriarch of the present? Because he is the symbol of Mesiras Nefesh, of giving one's life over for God and for the Jewish people. And that was the trait that was handed down successfully from the patriarchs. And that's why it doesn't have to mention Zecher, remember, in regard to Yitzchak's name. And it's true, Shmini Atzeres is also the present. But sometimes, even though this is the era of Eretz Yisrael, sometimes we have to leave Eretz Yisrael, but we never have to leave Torah. We have to leave Eretz Yisrael because of our own sins. Now, Sukkot, on one hand, represents the Jew of Chutz La'aretz, the Jew outside Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish people traversing through the desert, going to Eretz Yisrael. That's the Jew of Chutz La'aretz. When we go through Golus, as I've mentioned many times, exile is not just a trip away from Yerushalayim, not just a trip away from Eretz Yisrael, but it's primarily a trip towards Eretz Yisrael and towards Yerushalayim. So Sukkot, the 7 days of Sukkot, represent the Jew of Chutz La'aretz. And that's the holiday of Yaakov. Shmini Atzeres represents the Jew of Eretz Yisrael. And corresponding, Yaakov had 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. Leah is buried in Maras Machpelah. She's the mother of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Rachel dies as soon as they enter Eretz Yisrael. She's buried on the road, because she is the mother of the Jewish people of Chutz La'aretz, the ones who are traversing, the ones who will return to Eretz Yisrael. But Yaakov, in a sense, is both. Yaakov is not just identified with Shmini Atzeres. He's identified with Sukkot, with the Sukkah holiday. But the patriarch who is most identified with the present, with the era of the present, the Avraham and Yaakov, we need the Torah to keep them alive in the present. Yitzchak, much less so. Yitzchak is very much alive in the present. And that's why Afrel Shel Yitzchak, the ashes of Yitzchak, Nira Levafanai, it's not something that has to be remembered. It's seen before me in the present. It's seen before me in the present. I just want to add a few words. The idea is, certainly in regard to the other Avos who are identified with the past, that we need to remember the past. But the idea is we remember the past in order to bring the traits into the present. I just want to add a few words about the tragedy that took place in Eretz Yisrael. The tragedy that took place in Eretz Yisrael. Now, we don't understand why, and it'd be foolish on 2 levels. On a religious level to understand it, and certainly, they still have to investigate. And I heard all kinds of different reports and different rumors and different whatever as to what was the actual cause, the physical cause of the tragedy. We have to wait to hear. But we always have to take the lessons of the past and bring them into the present, and from the present into the future. We just went through COVID, and we saw in COVID how many people died. And unfortunately, the evidence seems to indicate that the tragedy of COVID did not end with the inoculations. Many of those who got COVID became impaired in other ways. Heart problems, kidney problems. And to a large degree, why is it? Because for some reason, people think they don't have to worry. They don't have to be concerned about safety. And to a large degree, many in the Haredi community had that approach as well. And especially when it came to religious ritual, going to shul, they weren't concerned about protecting themselves. And more than that, protected the others that they were infecting. They'll be machmir very much and not rely on any kulos and any heterim when it comes to Chol of Yisrael. You'll need someone to observe the milking of the cow, and it should be done. No one taking it away. But if one has to evaluate what's more important, the halacha declares sakonis nefashos docha kol haTorah. And we should have learned a lesson. And the problem is with the inoculations, even those who learned the lesson, with the inoculations, concern for safety, concern for health, that became a matter of the past. But we don't have to worry about it anymore. Maybe when with this tragedy that took place at Lag Bomer by the grave of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, maybe there's a reminder. It wasn't just COVID. There's no halachas about COVID. There's a halacha about not causing other people to die, to take special precautions. Maybe that reminds us that it's a general issue. And we shouldn't say, oh, it's not a halachic issue. It's more of a halachic issue than any other halachic issue. And we have to know that sakonis nefashos is docha kol haTorah kula, and the chai behem v'lo sheyamos behem, the mitzvos of the Torah were given that we should be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Lo hamesim yahaluka. So service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu demands that we be careful with safety precautions as well. Okay, we should be zocha that Klal Yisrael should be blessed. They say that Shavuos, Gemara in Sukkah says, in Megillah, that Shavuos represents, based on Gemara Rosh Hashanah, begins a new beginning. So it should be a new beginning of health and safety for us and for all Klal Yisrael.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah, I hear you. A little difficult, but I hear you.
Okay, so I don't know, maybe your volume's a little low. If anyone has any questions,
Yeah.
Please put it in the chat. Oops. No questions yet. Does anyone have any questions? Please put them in the chat. It doesn't look like there's any questions. Thank you very much. Yeshua, thank you all for being here. And
Okay.
We'll
So
be here
next Sunday again.
in 2 weeks, though. I think no share.
We're going to change. It'll be we'll have a share